This is it. I'm through. I'm dead. I'm done.
You gotta come up with something.
They'll never let me fly again. They're gonna ground me forever.
Ground you? You stole an airplane from the Air Force. You had a girl and an open bottle of champagne in the cockpit.
I'm screwed.
You're gonna be lucky if they let you walk again. So what are you gonna say?
I don't know.
Okay, look. Tell the colonel this girl is, like, terrified of flying. She had a brother who was killed in a plane crash. He got shot down in Vietnam. So you took her up in your plane to get her over the fear.
That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. They'll see right through it.
You're right. You're screwed.
Now, you tell me that doesn't sound like Ferris Bueller got a job at the Air Force and is still doing the things that he was doing in high school. You tell me. You tell me. I think it's Ferris Bueller. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in today's episode, we are going to go a little bit back in time to a simpler time, I suppose, 1987, to Jonathan Kaplan's Project X. Now, if you're not familiar with this story, that's okay. I don't think it made a lot of noise even. So it stars Matthew Broderick, and his face is plastered all over the posters and these kinds of things. But it came out in 1987, and so that's only a year after Ferris Bueller. I'm sure he was riding that high. And he kind of acts like a little bit of Ferris Bueller in the movie. So it's almost like, what did Ferris Bueller do after he graduated high school? Oh, he hung out with some apes in the Air Force? Oh, sounds good. The movie also stars Helen Hunt as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison doing primatology work, and specifically ape language project. And really, there isn't very many characters beyond Willie, who plays Virgil, the chimp, the main chimp in the story. William Sadler has a role of sort of the antagonist, but really the antagonist of this movie is the United States military / the United States government. And, well, it's kind of like two films rolled into one. There's a 15-minute, like, here's Virgil learning how to speak sign language, and then maybe a little bit more along the lines of the military is bad kind of plot. And the idea is they're using these chimps to learn how to do a flight simulator, and then they expose the ones that are really good at the flight simulator to ionizing radiation inside of a chamber. And, well, you know, you can imagine that when you get exposed to a high dose of ionizing radiation, you're probably going to die. And so this was like, what happens to humans if they were to get exposed by this? We need to make sure our pilots have enough time to drop payloads on the Soviet Union in case they, I don't know, bomb us or something, and then we bomb them, and so many ridiculous things that lead up to this. But in any case, Matthew Broderick's character, Jimmy Garrett, there we go, I got it, sees that Virgil knows how to speak sign language, and so he's like, of course, there's got to be more to these apes, and the rest of the story follows. So this story is kind of like an early exploration, or at least the zeitgeist of the time, or the I should say, the zeitgeist in that the animal rights movement is in full swing here in the mid to late 80s. So we are experiencing a narrative exploring both sides of this debate within this film. And I've got a really good guest to help us explore this film. So without further ado, as I always say, let's jump right into it. My guest host today is Dr. Karen Brakke. She's a professor of psychology and the co-director of the Teaching Resource and Research Center at Spelman College in Atlanta. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. I'm so happy to be here. It's a great honor to be on this podcast.
I appreciate that, and I'm very happy to have you on. Before we start discussing the film that you brought to the show today, we definitely have a lot to say about this one. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts of film in general, and about and if you could, a little bit about using them in psychology courses.
Yeah. So, I love film as a storytelling tool. I have some interest in storytelling as pedagogy, and, films can be a fantastic way to do that. Effective way of telling stories. They're in the culture, and there's a lot of potential for teaching there, especially in psychology. We're talking about the human experience, right? And those are the stories we love. And having said that, in my teaching, just given the classes I teach, I've pretty much stuck with documentaries. I teach a lot of child development kinds of courses and other things, courses where there's a lot of really good documentaries. So they're just not fictional stories, but they still provide that story arc a lot of times that can be valuable and can illustrate some of what we're talking about much better than, just talking about it or even doing sometimes classroom activities. Seeing that story that's powerful, it can be really effective.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite documentaries, just in general, not just in psychology, have a really good story arc to them. And I know that Morgan Spurlock is a controversial figure in documentary filmmaking, and he's got some interesting ideas. But I find that his documentaries are enrapturing because of the story that he puts behind them. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Now, not to put you on the spot, but what documentaries, what are some of the often used documentaries that you use?
So let's see. One I show in developmental psychology quite a bit. It has some problems with it, but it's still, to me, a very powerful one, is The Lost Children of Rockdale County. And it talks about a syphilis outbreak in the 1990s, so it's older, in actually a suburb of Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
And the syphilis outbreak started with 12 and 13-year-old girls. And it turned out there was this network of 200 teenagers involved. And it starts out as a story about syphilis, but it ends up being really kind of a critique of parenting and communities just leaving the children, the teenagers, to themselves and fending for themselves. There's no oversight. There's no sense of community. In terms of, these are suburbs that grew up very quickly, and parents are all off working, trying to financially improve their lives. And there's a lot, it gets into teen identity, teen risk behavior. There's some commentary on race that my students pick up on right away, and justice that, are difficult to watch. Another one is The Medicated Child.
Okay,
talking about
I've
prescription
heard that
medicines with kids. There's another one. Oh shoot, what is it? Talking about mental health in the prison system, and I can't remember the name of it right now.
Oh, that one sounds interesting too.
But it's talking about how prisons are now the primary largest mental health facilities in the country.
I did hear that.
What happens in the prison, and then when people get out of the prison.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot because, we have these massive populations of prisoners throughout the country. And then, when they get when they get released, they still have stuff to deal with. And we talked about this on a previous episode, a few episodes ago, with Shawshank Redemption, and one of the characters who could have used some mental health care after he had gotten out, and he eventually takes his own life. So yeah, that's a lot. And thank you for sharing those documentaries. But of course, for this program, we're going to shift to fiction films. And I will be honest. I think this is actually kind of funny. Here I'm going to be self-deprecating. So at the beginning of Project X, there is a little title card that has just a few words on it saying what the Air Force was doing with chimps in the 1980s, which is when the film was released and when the film was set. And I took that as fact. And I went to look it up afterward. I'm like, oh, what about Project X was actually real? Nothing about the movie has any basis in what the U.S. military was doing in the 1980s with chimps. Now, there may be things that were sort of kind of like what was happening in the movie, but the movie itself is not based on real events. And yeah, I felt kind of dumb.
No, you shouldn't, because I did present it that way, right? And there were things going on in the military, maybe not in the 80s. And there was research, that did use non-human primates to train for or substitute for human pilots. I mean, think about Ham, the chimpanzee who was sent up into space.
Right. Yeah. I knew about the
and there's
space.
other stuff going on. Yeah. There's other stuff going on in research labs. And so this had a military setting, I think, just to give it that extra, creepy government kind of thing going on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because the government is the bad guy in this movie.
Right. But there was, this was an age where there was a new animal rights movement, right? Before this, it was animals are, for many years, right, behaviorism. Animals don't have a soul. Animals can't feel pain. They're, classical and operant conditioning only. And so this is the age in the 80s where people, started having a cognitive revolution for animals, started, recognizing some of the things animals can do, started being concerned. PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, arose during this era.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think, is the cultural setting that this movie was responding to, rather than the specifics.
Yeah. I took that title card as truth. Woo, boy. So before we get more into the meat of that, because I do want to explore what you just said a little bit more. But so you chose Project X. So what made you choose that, Karen? So
really, because I was trying to think of movies I haven't seen. I haven't gone to the theater in quite a while.
Oh, yeah.
So, I'm pretty much a Netflix girl. And and I'm also, given my specialty, I'm not a personality or social psychologist, which a lot of films, it seems easier to find. I don't know, it might be just my bias or something. It seems like it'd be easier to find films to talk about with that. As someone who focuses in research on 1 to 3 year olds, there aren't that many movies to really pick apart that I know.
Look who's talking.
They're out there, but yeah. So
look who's talking, and look who's talking too.
Right. Yeah, I guess we could, and maybe I'll go back and watch those, and we can go on next year about those. But so I went back a little further into my past when my graduate work actually was working on one of these ape language projects. And
that's really cool, by the way.
And it was a cool time. I was on the Rumbaugh project with Kanzi the bonobo, and worked with him and the other bonobos and chimpanzees there for about 11 years.
Wow.
And so, and that was when I was there when this movie came out, and we watched movies at the lab with the chimps, or with apes, with the bonobos and the chimps. And this was one of the movies that we had in our library. So I remembered it, and it came to mind when I thought back then. And the other movies I remember are Quest for Fire and Harry and the Hendersons. And quite frankly, I didn't really see talking about them for an hour. So, this one I think is interesting at a couple of different levels. And in terms of the issues that it brings up, it's old, it's hard to find, it's kind of a sleeper movie in some ways.
Oh yeah.
But I think there are things to talk about and unpack for it that are relative to the work we do.
Yeah, I think when you said that you were doing ape language projects at the time, I was like, oh, okay. So maybe this will be like the Planet of the Apes, the reboot version, where they spend a little bit more time with Caesar, I think is the name of the chimp that eventually develops language for those films, which is supposed to be like the prequel to the even Charlton Heston ones, where he goes through time when he's traveling faster than the speed of light.
Which that was the very first movie I ever saw when it first came out. Yeah, that's how old I am. Yeah. So to me, Caesar is Roddy McDowell. Anyway.
Exactly, right? So I thought that's where you were going, and then you mentioned Project X, and I was like, huh? What? And of course, a name like Project X doesn't really give you much of anything. And so when I looked it up, you were like, not the 2012 film. I of course, that's going to be the one that comes up in searches first. So everyone who is listening to this and does want to partake in this discussion and find out, all the things that we're talking about, the 2012 version has nothing to do with apes. So don't watch that one. So I was excited when I started watching this because you didn't really give me a ton to go on, which was fine. Go in there with some blind eyes.
With the
cycling.
Being fresh, right? I didn't want to influence you one way or the other.
Exactly.
I wanted to hear your honest reactions about it.
Exactly. Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that because that's how I like to go into films, even ones that I think about constantly, like Marvel films, and getting all of the goodies on those. Like I watch a ton of YouTube videos in anticipation of those movies, but for everything else, I tend to want to come in, with as little expectation as possible. And I do think I'll just give some broad thoughts on it first, and then you can give your broad thoughts, and then we can jump into the psych. So broad thoughts, I thought the film was okay. I didn't necessarily like the pacing and or overall plot. I do like the psych stuff in it. I think that should go without saying. But overall, I really thought it was almost an interesting sequel to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, because Matthew Broderick comes into this film right after the success of Ferris Bueller, and that film did have real-time success. It's gotten quite a bit. I would say over the last 3 decades, continued success. It's one of those films that sort of doesn't die. But he came into it a year later, and he almost looks exactly the same. His characterization, Jimmy, is his name. And so, yeah, it's not Ferris, but it's Jimmy. He doesn't go by James. So I thought that, I was like, so I suppose I'm watching another version of Ferris Bueller. Maybe he's a little bit more grown up because he's in the Air Force now. But not really, because it starts off with him being a
rebel,
ne'er-do-well, mess up.
Ne'er-do-well.
And he has to get assigned to the secret project where apes are being used chimps specifically are being used to act as human pilot analogs, and then get exposed to radiation. Sorry, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen it, which I think is everyone. Whether or not you'll go and watch it is up to you. It was on HBO in October 2021, so you might be able to find it. But they get exposed to radiation to see how long they would live for pilots getting into the situation if a nuclear war.
I wanted to tell you, man.
Then why didn't you?
You didn't have clearance.
Hey, that's bullshit, man. You were supposed to be my friend.
Hey, what do you think is going on here? You see them take JT out. He doesn't come back. What do you think is going on down that tunnel?
I didn't know. So what is it? What is it? Are they all?
Yes, all. Look, they radiate the chimps to see how long they can fly before they die. They're supposed to tell us if our guys can survive long enough to get to Russia in case World War III happens. There's nothing you can do about it, man. It's the Air Force. Jimmy, you do your job, or you're gonna wind up like Watts.
What happened to Watts anyway?
Couldn't handle it. Got too attached.
He was crazy.
No. He went AWOL. He couldn't handle it. Me, Jimmy, I treat these animals well, but I don't get too attached to them. That's what you got to do.
So I'm the new Lord of the Apes.
Look, Jimmy, you had to take that promotion. You don't want to stay around here, man. You do your job. Don't get involved. You'll be out of here before you know it. You forget all about this place, man.
Interesting for where the Cold War was in the late 80s. And like I said a few minutes ago, the U.S. government / the U.S. military is really the villain in this film. It's more of a villain of convenience than anything else. And then I think a really oddly characterized doctor is sort of part of the villainy as well, which I thought was weird, but
I think they put him in there as the foil for the, he was making the arguments that were the establishment arguments at the time.
Yeah, and so I think hearing what you have to say about that might help me with this one, with that part specifically. But overall, I thought the acting was okay. Matthew Broderick was being Matthew Broderick. Helen Hunt, though, I loved her character because she seemed really invested as a graduate student, trying to, teach Virgil, our main character chimp, to communicate. And of course, he could within the context of the film. I don't know. You can probably go into this more, Karen, but I don't know how much of that was just the chimp. Willie, I think, was the chimp's real name, was just hitting marks or was actually communicating. So I'd love to hear more about that from you. So overall, it was an okay film. I won't give it a big thumbs down, but I will give it a big thumb sideways.
Yeah, I understand that. And it's not on my top 5 list or anything
Right.
like that. It was a great movie in the day for the Sunday afternoon watching TV. It was on a lot back in the day.
Wow, okay.
Those Sunday where you're just flipping channels and something's coming on. That's sort of the role that it had at a few years after it was released. Just a couple of things. Again. Matthew Broderick, that was he was always had that character, like Bloxy Blues, I think was similar, right?
Yes.
That if he had played something really different, people may not have accepted it as his type or whatever.
Right.
He was in the middle. That's what he played off of, and that's what he had. I did see, I think they were trying to show some growth in him and some development in him, whether that worked or not, but there were definitely Ferris Bueller moments in there for sure, right at the beginning, and then when he was in the bar playing poker with the other guys, that was straight out of that same character.
Yeah.
And Helen Hunt, hey, we have a psychology grad student in a movie as a main character, and she's not clinically analyzing anyone,
exactly,
or not stereotyped in that way, so that was good. But yeah, in terms of the apes, I don't think they were actually communicating. They were clearly intelligent, and intentional. And there was that eye contact there. They had human relationships. I suspect they were trained for the movie to do these particular actions. I know I was actually looking up, like you, I was kind of looking on the web to see more about the making of the movie. It was actually controversial because there's some, allegations out there that ironically, in making this movie about supporting animal rights, they actually didn't always treat the animals real well.
I was afraid of that.
So that's a little disappointing, because these are, apes that are way stronger than we are. They seem to be fairly tightly controlled. They did a lot of cool things. They were very good in their roles, right?
Yeah.
There were clearly things that they did that were, showed their intelligence. But I imagine they were trained for a lot of those. You could tell, when they sat down, they were being told to sit down. They were looking over at their person to get those cues.
Yeah, I felt like it was a lot of mark hitting. But even still, the early scenes where we learn about Virgil and his ability to be communicative with sign language with Helen Hunt in her language lab. There were some scenes of them in the same space. So I did find that rather interesting because Willie, who played Virgil, would play off of what Helen Hunt was doing, which is pretty complex. So they're looking over at their handlers a lot when it's just them on the screen. They're not looking at anybody else. It's just their handlers and their trainers. But when it was just the two of them, I was like, well, they had to teach Helen Hunt what to do, and then teach Willie to play off of what Helen Hunt was doing, which, that takes a lot.
Yeah. And I think I'd be interested to hear the actors, the human actors now, to hear what they did and how much time they spent with Willie and the, maybe a couple of the other chimps. I think there were like 5 altogether.
Yeah.
But to develop a relationship and, how much time they spent interacting, and with, and then with cameras rolling, how much time it took to get those couple 10-second scenes where they're interacting with each other and helping each other out and doing things together. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of, I thought they edited it fairly well. But clearly, it takes a lot to get the apes actually communicating with sign and being referential like that. But they, for a movie, they did what they could. It's not entirely accurate, of course, but
right. It comes across to me as seamless enough that if you weren't a psychologist, and I think that's the point here, that if you're not a psychologist and you're not steeped within animal cognition or even sign language or anything like that, maybe you don't even know who Coco the gorilla is or was, that it should look like Virgil, the character, is communicating via sign language.
Right.
Rudimentarily, but,
right.
Communicating that way. So what I want to do first is talk about like the first part of the movie, because it seemingly plays a little bit like 2 different films in the beginning of the movie, and we'll call that the first 15 minutes or so, and then the rest of the movie is Helen Hunt as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison doing these ape language. And so as somebody with experience in this animal cognition situation, if you want to give us a little bit of background on how that kind of process works, what are the things that go into it, what are the ideas surrounding specifically like ape cognition, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So Yeah, there was a lot going on at that time. There were, a number of these animal language projects, mostly with chimpanzees. Also, as you mentioned, Coco the gorilla,
Mhm.
Alex the parrot, um, and they took different approaches at the time because everybody was trying to figure out what's the best way to communicate with apes. I'll focus on the ape work and the chimpanzee work in particular. So, sign language, of course. Was a prominent type of communication because American Sign Language already existed. It was a language system that could be used and adapted. Vocal, there were some early vocal attempts, but chimps don't have the same vocal apparatus that we do, and they don't have the
Right.
same air control. So that kind of got ruled out pretty quickly. So there were several sign language projects. And those met with mixed success.
Okay.
And I won't go into all the critiques right now. Some of the critiques were that, apes were just being repetitive, that it's hard to know, with ape hands, if they put their hand up towards their mouth, that can be a number of different signs.
Sure.
Right. There's often not a lot of precision there, that maybe we have a little more dexterity and to distinguish between the sign for food and the sign for flower, for example.
Right.
And so it leaves a lot open to interpretation of what's being signed and what's not. And some of those projects too were critiqued because they didn't have a stable base of caregivers. They would have people just, a number of different graduate students sort of playing that Helen Hunt role, where they'd come in for a couple hours, try to operantly condition the chimp to sign and then leave. And that didn't seem to work much at all.
Right.
And opened itself to a lot of the critiques I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So of course I'm a little biased because our project used a different approach. We had a stable group of caregivers. We were with them when they were little 24/7 to develop those relationships. We used the touch symbols. So this was the Kanzi project that some of your listeners may be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
We used touch symbols so that it was clear what they were touching, because often this was the early days where you could have electronic keyboards that gave you audio feedback with the word.
Yeah.
So you could tell what it was and it would register on the computer, for example. And we also raised the bonobos and chimps from early age, rather than starting when they were 4 or 5 years old. And that made a difference too, because, their plasticity when they're very young.
Right. Yeah.
So, so I think our project the Rumbaugh project kind of moved the needle a little further along than any of the other projects. I'm biased, but the apes that we raised clearly had understood the English vocabulary, receptive words, demonstrated that under test conditions.
Mm-hmm.
They, used about anywhere from 100 to a couple hundred symbols. The bonobos did better than the chimpanzee.
Okay. I've heard that.
that. Yeah. They have a little more flexibility and just was a little bit easier. It's like they were A students and the chimpanzee were C students in some ways. But anyway, but a lot of people are a little bit threatened, that apes can do stuff like that. And that's kind of one of the things with the cognitive revolution of ape cognition. It threatens our feeling of being special as humans. What is it that makes us human that's special and different from other related species? Which is pushback.
Which has always been a fascinating question for me, because I don't know. I mean, other than language, I don't know what, and honestly, it's a biased lens from which we look at language here, because other animals have an amazing set of language and communication skills. Like I'll just marine mammals, for example, whales and dolphins. So it's always been an interesting philosophical question for me. It's like, why do we need to find the special
Right.
just the special piece, the special sauce of humanity. I mean, yeah, we've created technology. I I was thinking about this. This is one of my shower thoughts. I think it was yesterday or the day before. I thought to myself, man, if we're trying to find out what makes humans so special, it's probably because we make our own problems and then we refuse to solve them.
That could be it.
I mean, it's probably one of them, because I imagine some animals could make their own problems. Maybe dogs or cats make their own problems, but at least they attempt to solve them.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's our belief in conspiracies and the things that we do. Yeah, that's probably as good an answer as any. But I think, getting back to the language and the specialness of language, I think that ties in with the music, right? Because as soon as Matthew Broderick saw that Virgil, who is Willie's character, was communicating via sign, and I'm not going to get into whether that's true language or not, right? There's language and communication, and we could go on I could talk about that for a long time. But as soon as he sees that kind of symbolic communication that they're trying to portray there, his view changes, right? And suddenly, and that, to him, that makes the animals that much closer to humanity.
And a commercial came on, and it was for a charity, see, so the woman in it was using sign language, and she's saying, help,
Garrett,
help.
Is there a point to this story?
Well, yeah, see, that's when I realized that Virgil here is using sign language to communicate with me. There, see that? He just made the sign for apple. No, Virgil, you can't have the apple because you gave it to your girlfriend last night, you remember? Sir, I think that this could be of great benefit to the program. Here, watch. This is the sign for food, see? Okay. Food. Come on, food. There, see?
Yeah, well, somebody obviously conditioned him to do that. I mean, it's like Pavlov's dog. The bell rings and he salivates. You must have learned about that in high school?
No. He makes signs all the time, and nobody is ringing any bells.
When a dog is happy, he wags his tail. When he has to urinate, he scratches on the door. Now, you wouldn't call that sign language, would you?
But this is different. He's using words.
Garrett, what you're talking about has no conceivable relationship to the task we're trying to accomplish here. Now, I appreciate enthusiasm, but I suggest you unclutter your mind and put your energy to the work at hand.
Sir, maybe if we looked in the files, we might be able to find out some more
about him. We don't need to look in the
him.
files.
No, we don't. That's absolutely right.
And that's where the tension comes in is, okay, now if there's not that much difference between animals and humans, why are we willing to sacrifice animals for human good? And that was the bigger argument at the time, because animal research has benefited humans over the years, biomedical research and so forth.
Yeah, let's look at that a little bit more closely. Yeah. So you said at this time,
and that's the second part of the movie, I guess. Is
right, exactly. Into, right? we move on from the graduate school setting, and we move into a very sterile military setting where instead of getting to hang out in a room full of toys and things like that, it's now very sterile cages that have big old bars, and the vivarium just looks like a jail cell. So, Karen, you said at this time is when the animal rights movement, especially in research, kicked into high gear a few minutes ago. Please, for the listeners, go into a little bit more detail. I can't speak to any of this, but I am interested in hearing about it from somebody who's sort of lived through this firsthand.
Yeah, so throughout much of, I'll say, just the 20th century, there was this sort of Cartesian view, based on Descartes, and I was reading up on this a little bit. So, of animals, if they don't have souls, they don't feel pain. Right. I think, therefore I am. Right. So you have to have, this sort of reflective cognition in order to have identity and a soul. And that's, how all this human experience, reflecting on pain. And that, if animals don't have that, and animals just respond to Skinnerian kinds of techniques, then, you can pretty much do what you want with them,
Yeah.
because they're not feeling pain, right? And we don't want to, we don't want to subject humans to this, but animals can tolerate it better, and they don't have as much value, for example. And so a lot of stuff was going on with animals, and people were pretty much doing whatever.
Yikes.
And yeah, there were always groups that kind of tried to, anti-vivisectionists to complain about it, but they never got much traction until the 1980s.
Okay.
1970s, 1980s. That is when along with the human cognitive revolution, the animal cognitive revolution was coming along. There are some labs that were exposed in terms of the research that they were doing just seemed really atrocious.
Wow.
The way that they were treating animals, and particularly non-human primates.
Wow.
Just, they were doing nerve research and brain injury research, and it's hard to talk about and hard to hear about, as particularly if you're thinking about apes. Think about at the same time Jane Goodall and all the all that's going on, right? So apes are becoming much more relatable to us, and other non-human primates were starting to see more commonalities. So people started thinking about this and exposing labs. A couple of people would infiltrate labs and release videos of this, of these animals suffering. And this became a big debate within the research community. To what extent are researchers justified in creating animal suffering in order to support human good? And some of the animal rights people were breaking into labs and stealing research animals, threatening researchers. Some researchers were just coming across as very insensitive and, we don't care. We're trying to benefit humans, and, very old school views. And in the 80s are when the first animal care and use committees came about, on the heels of IRBs and human ethics.
Yeah.
There was also that going on. So just a lot of things going on. That was a very long answer to what your question was. But a lot of things were going on in society, looking at sort of this recognition of primates and our place among the animal world, and questioning the distance between humans and others animals, just like you were mentioning before. Why do we need this? But apparently a lot of people do want to feel special and do want to feel that we're not just animals, rather than part of the natural world, because then you have to start addressing all of these tough questions. So this film, I think, was one of the films that kind of came out of that to bring some of these issues to the public, and that the chief doctor, or whoever, the William Sadler character, he was the one kind of presenting these arguments for, this is what, why we have to have this research. And of course it's going to make us feel uncomfortable, but the greater good, and animals don't feel pain. He was the character that was put in that position to, and it didn't always work. It was kind of a weird character, as you say. He was the bad guy, though, but they portrayed it as the bad guy.
Right, exactly. He is the mouthpiece for the U.S. government, and of course, we can definitely make a distinction between university, whether they're state or private universities doing these kinds of studies, versus the U.S. military, which is going to do things in a far more quick and dirty way, even outside of, because they can always put a, this is classified, and essentially that's what they do in the film, is only a select number of people get to know what this project actually is, even though there are murmurs amongst the other crew that work there. But the government can put a lid on things that other organizations like universities and private research labs can't really do. And when you bring that up, it's kind of interesting. When I teach sensation and perception, I discuss a lot of animal studies because a lot of animal work was done on chimps and cats, for example, in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And a lot of what we know about our visual system, for example, comes from cutting open, vivisecting brains and putting sensors or electrodes inside these brains to find out what happens when a light goes on versus when a light goes off. That's obviously an oversimplification, but honestly, that's what they were doing. And in this movie, they're subjecting the chimps to high dose ionizing radiation, which would be felt by anyone in a radiation cloud after a big nuclear weapon would be detonated. And so I honestly, after the first chimp, I don't know why they need anyone else.
Yeah, well, it's for the story.
Right.
It's for the story because we have to get to
even in real life, they
Yeah.
do an n greater than 1 there. But I think even in the 1980s, we knew what was going to happen when you got exposed to radiation and how long it might take you based on the dosage of radiation that you get. So I thought that was interesting, but I yes, in service of the story, they needed Virgil to be the linchpin.
Endangered. Yeah.
So from a research point of view, how well does each pocket do in your book? The Helen Hunt pocket at the beginning of the film where, she's teaching Virgil sign language, and then the research at the Air Force Base. How well do they work in your mind?
There's pieces of truth in there.
Okay.
I think there's pieces. So for the Helen Hunt part, when she stopped, trying to just get him to say apple when she already knew the answer, and made it so that it was functional, that he, she stopped and she gave up and said, okay, I'm just going to eat the apple. And that's when he wanted it, right? Because that's when he had to actually use the sign to communicate what he wanted.
Yeah.
Right. That piece has a little validity to it, and that why should they, make the signs if you already know the answer, if it's not communicating anything and not functional. And I was amused by the, Virgil just running back and forth and ignoring her. There are moments like that as well. But of course, a lot of the stuff didn't ring quite true. And then, with them, having these chimps calmly go and sit in the flight simulators, and just sit there for a long time and try to work the flight simulators and actually fly.
I thought that was so
for
dumb.
a raisin here and there, and nobody got bitten. Nobody, not that. I should say, not that the apes not that they're going to bite everybody every day, but you got them in cages. You got people who don't know them. You got people reaching out for them. There's going to be a bite happening somewhere there.
Or even just
with people who don't know what they're doing, which clearly these people working with these chimps did not know.
Yeah, exactly. Just get some grunts here to come and move them from place to place.
Right. And it might just be a little warning bite, but that kind of thing. And I don't want to give the chimps a bad name. But just little things like that people were doing really stupid things and getting away with it. In some respects, the most authentic scenes were the ones where the chimps rebelled at the end. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And were just going through the lab and doing what they wanted to do.
I thought that was great. And it's, I think in a way, they were showing what they thought of the lab.
Yeah. And I, that actually is an exaggeration too, because again, I in my experience, if you have a good relationship with them, things are pretty calm. You can get them to do things. We did sit for a long time and do different tasks and different activities. But you had to stay, it had to be someone who had a good relationship with them, who they saw as someone being in control. And you had to kind of be reading them at their level every moment. So I don't want to portray sort of the sort of work I did as just being chaos.
Yeah.
But you had to really work hard on reading them and anticipating what might happen and knowing them as individuals in order to keep it moving forward and to keep things where you could focus on their learning.
Well, I want to pick back up with that point, but let's take a quick break and we'll come back. And I do have a quick question for you to round out that discussion. We'll be right back with Dr. Karen Brakke. Howdy. Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope you're enjoying the conversation. Over the past 2 years, the podcast has grown, and that's mostly in part to folks like you, the listeners. We've also had wonderful luck receiving support from the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, APA Division II Small Partnerships Grant. It's been a fun ride, and we want to keep it going. So we need your help. There are several ways that you can support this show. You can share episodes with your social media networks so we can grab new listeners. You can join our fledgling Patreon program. You can contribute directly using PayPal, or you can purchase some sweet merchandise with our logo at our Spreadshirt merch store. All of those things can be found on the website cinemapsychpod.swanpsych.com. But perhaps the best thing that you can do is to keep listening and leave us feedback on Facebook or Twitter so we know you've listened. Thanks. And now back to the show.
All of us here recognize how remarkable the work you've done is. And you know you have a good shot at a position on this faculty.
They're not taking Virgil away.
Terry, don't throw all that away because of an attachment to this animal.
Bring them here. Let them see how much he's learned. When they see how much he's learned...
They don't care. I've been on the phone with them all morning. It's like talking to a brick wall.
Well, I don't care. I'm keeping him.
The National Health Foundation owns him.
I'll buy him.
And where are you going to find the $15,000?
I'll raise it.
Not to mention the $10,000 a year for food and a veterinarian. Come on.
I'll get it.
We all knew this was a temporary arrangement when he got here.
I raised him. He doesn't know anybody but me. He's not going to understand what's happening.
There's a new children's zoo in Houston. I think he's going to be sent there. He'll be well cared for and well loved.
So we are back with Dr. Karen Brakke. We are talking about Project X, a film that came out in 1987 starring Matthew Broderick. He's got his face plastered on the poster. You wouldn't know there were chimps involved unless you looked very closely. Before the break, Karen, we were talking about we'll call it truth of the research situations. And you brought up an interesting point that I wanted to go a little bit further with. So you had mentioned that the Air Force research scenes are a little hokey and cut a lot of research corners. You had mentioned when you, in the last segment, when we first started talking about your experience with these ape language projects, that you tended to get them rather young, months old. Whereas the movie doesn't really show that. These chimps go to this Air Force base at whatever age. So what would be the difference then in relationship starting at young in your experience versus what would happen in a research setting like the Air Force Base with older chimps?
Yeah. So again, I can only speak to my setting and the way we did
Right.
things.
Yeah, sure.
It might be different other places, but for us and the environment that we were trying to encourage, we were trying to give the apes a lot of freedom, a lot of context to learn, right? And a very rich environment.
Mhm.
Um, so, and they were being asked to learn pretty complex things, right? Referential communication using symbols.
Yeah.
And so we had, daily routines that we would go for, and we were in with them, and we had different rooms in different areas and different places we would go. Our project is documented elsewhere. And so, for us, in it was really important. It was the people who started working with them when they were, basically very young, um, who were able to sort of take that surrogate parent role, that were able to maintain kind of parent-ish relationship, I'll say.
Mhm.
Um,
A
in
la Harry
in that,
Harlow's.
well, a little more complex than that.
Yeah.
But when they're little, the people who provide care, who they listen to, um they want to get along with, who know how to anticipate their needs and their what's going on, and are sensitive to their what they're thinking or what their emotions are at the time, can tell when they're getting tense, for example. um it's just like you know a a a a, a grown man still listening to his mother, right? um and so if you don't establish them when they're real young, and you try to come in when they're older and they have more autonomy and they're already stronger than you, the tools you have at your disposal are more limited. And so it's harder to develop that relationship at the level that we were doing it. You can still, work with them and have good relationships. But for what, we were trying to do with the symbol learning and so forth, it was really dependent on starting when they're young, when they're
Yeah.
plastic, uh, their brains have had more plasticity, I should say.
Mhm.
So it's the relationship, and starting with the project and the symbols learning and introducing language at a very young age, just like with human babies, right? Once they reach a certain age, it's harder for them to learn a particular language.
Right. Sure.
Their brains are wired differently. So if you wait too long in terms of understanding English, for example,
Sure.
they're not going to understand it in the same way as maybe if you really work on it when they're babies.
So this is my big question for you then, Karen, as far as learning things goes. Do you think a chimp who is older can learn how to fly a flight simulator?
I would be they can learn joysticks, right?
Sure.
They can learn to do things. There's a whole literature on computer interactions to test ape cognition.
Really? That was a more of a glib question, but okay.
Yeah, there's joysticks and touch screens and computer mediated tasks
Okay.
are one of the main ways that we found out a lot about ape capabilities and monkey capabilities.
Okay.
In terms of counting or numerosity,
Mhm.
and other cognitive processes, understanding of same and different and kind of things. So they can use computers, but some tasks are more difficult than others. And with the flight simulator, I think if they had particular things that they had to do, like to find a certain image and then get reinforced for that,
Mhm.
or there was some outcome for it, they might be able to learn that. But the way they were teaching them, I think it would be, I didn't see how they were putting that all together. You'd have to, I think you could train it somehow. but not the way they did it.
Yeah, because for anyone who is not familiar with flying a plane, it requires all of your limbs. Well, maybe only one of your hands, but depending on what one hand is doing, the other hand is probably doing something else. But it also requires you to work feet, which make you go left or right on the ground and in the air. The feet move the rudder, which is a similar thing to what is on a boat, but here is you're moving in 360 degrees, where on a boat you are on a surface, right? You're not going down or up, you're just going left or right. But in the air, you got to go left, right, up, down, and side to side. So it didn't look to me as though, and of course this is probably we just want to serve the story versus showing you actual training of these chimps in these flight simulators. We also don't get a sense of time that Matthew Broderick's character Jimmy is there at this base. They don't really show us. It could be weeks, it could be months. It's kind of difficult to tell. I don't know, Karen, do you have a sense of how much time elapses specifically for Virgil, because we see him do the flight simulator for the first time, and then at the end of the film see him actually lift a plane off a real plane off the ground.
Right. So time was hard. I get the sense that it was like a series of months.
Okay.
Just because, he called Helen Hunt, and it didn't seem like it was that far back. And mostly, and also, what I was noticing was that they were mostly young chimps, and they stayed young chimps. Virgil did not age at all once he got to the Air Force Base.
Yeah, it was very. I guess it would have been difficult to age them. There was one chimp who looked, Bluebeard, I guess, looked a little bit older to me, but there was
they painted on his.
Okay, they gave him some gray.
Goliath was a little
Goliath. Okay,
the circus one. He was a little older.
Okay,
but most of them stayed pretty young. So, and I don't know if that was intentional or not, as part of the story, or if that's just the filming schedule that they had.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say it's impossible for them to do a flight simulator, but just the way they were having them do it, and for a raisin here and there, I'm not sure that's the way
I thought that was for a raisin. Oh man, I mean, I know I'm not a chimp, but you give me a raisin, I will not do what you want me to do, because I will not eat the raisin. That's definitely not going to happen.
Yeah, but I will say, just in terms of interacting with a computer, that's one of the things that has been discovered, is they've really discovered a lot more depth to what non-human primates can do. Right. Because of being able to use the computer. It lets you ask questions in new ways, and it's turned out to be really successful.
Yeah, I'd honestly be interested if they have if it has been determined, I'll say. I don't want to say whether or not they have it, because they might, and we just don't know. The multiple dexterity. But then again, now that I think about it, it's like they have 4 hands anyways.
Yeah. So the foot part I'm not that concerned about, because their feet have a lot of dexterity in their feet, and they're also actually will use their feet instead of their hands for some things sometimes.
Yeah.
What they have trouble with, and what I ended up getting interested in and went into work with the kids, was their hand coordination and how they use their 2 hands together. That they actually have a little more trouble with. Sort of like operating a joystick with one hand and pushing a fire button with another hand.
Mm-hmm.
That was actually difficult for some of the ones we worked with.
Okay. Yeah, because when you're flying a plane, you have a lot of different movements that need to be coordinated in a specific amount of time. Otherwise, you're just going to go and then blow up.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is interesting, because that was the thing that was really in the back of my mind, if as far as story goes, and maybe that's part of the reason why I wasn't a big fan of this, is because I am willing to suspend my disbelief for any fictional film if the internal logic of the film is consistent. And
Mhm.
I don't feel like the flight simulator was internally consistent. I don't feel like the logic of it was internally consistent because of the complexity of flying a plane and the limited complexity from which they showed it.
Mhm.
And so that didn't jive for me. I
Yeah.
didn't
No,
like that.
I totally understand that. Yeah. I do think that for me was one of the weaker part of the film too.
So we have Virgil, who is an ape that knows how to communicate, and he communicates with Matthew Broderick's character. And Matthew Broderick, Jimmy, says, "No, don't send him to the final simulation with the radiation, because we can learn more from him." And as you say, Karen, he struggles with his personal ethics here. And I think this is a very good discussion to have, because animal rights issues do feature quite prominently within psychology. I mean, we can talk about it broadly, but I think within psychology, especially when you get new students who don't know anything about the nuance of animal research within psychology, see that research is being done on non-human primates and rats and all sorts of other animals, and they're like, well, we can't do that. So I do want to jump into an ethics argument, maybe for a little, not an argument between the two of us, but the debate on the ethics of animal research.
Mhm.
So from your perspective, what is the ethical dilemma that Jimmy faces in this film?
So I think is if because the ethical dilemma really starts hitting home when he starts thinking of Virgil as sentient,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because of the communication. So, to what extent is it appropriate and ethical to harm one sentient being um, to benefit of another, particularly when the benefit is not clear?
Okay, I like that. Yeah, the benefit not clear.
You're right. It's very questionable the way it's presented. His argument, the way he presents the argument in the movie.
Right.
And so I think he goes back and forth, right? He tries to kind of remove sort of that or ignore that sentence from Virgil in term, when he gets the new position, and he's also warring with his ambition, right? His ambition versus and duty and wanting to get back out there and be a pilot.
Yeah.
With also doing the right things by the chimps,
Right.
trying
Exactly.
to help the chimps and make a better life for them under the conditions that they're working on. So at one point in the film, when he says, okay, this is my job, I've got to do it, he tries to ignore Virgil.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets upset with him. And that's when Virgil starts misbehaving all over again, right? Because he's disrupting their relationship. And that kind of fails spectacularly and leads to a series of events. And then he finally comes down on the side of helping the chimps, and his future becomes ambiguous in the Air Force. But he finally decides that this is the right thing to do. But I really think it has to do with the sentence and the things that they do in the movie. There's a couple of moments where they have the chimps look right at the camera as if they're looking at one of the characters, as if they're looking at Matthew Broderick or at the lab chief, where they give them this very human look, right? This very accusing glare, like, you did this to me.
Yes.
One is in the radiation chamber, and one is when the chimps are all out. I don't know if you saw, they had, was it Goofy or one of the little ones sitting up high looking just like a judge?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do recall that. Yeah.
And they really lingered on that. So I think they were really trying to push that these are sentient beings, and that you can't just treat them as if they're not, and that adds a new moral imperative. I think that's what the movie was saying.
I like that. And the first chimp that Jimmy witnesses go through this whole thing does have that very long, mournful look at Jimmy, like, what did I just witness? And they did this interesting trick of the camera where they make it go in slow motion, and the only thing that they do is these flash of lights, which have nothing to do with, shooting radiation at somebody, but they did it, I think, to reflect the moment and have that look linger, and Jimmy really feel that deeply, whether it's scorn, disdain, massive amounts of sorrow, knowing,
Yeah.
we tend to give, we might be anthropomorphizing a little bit, but we tend to give animals the ability to sense things that we cannot, right? So we say that dogs know when there's going to be something dangerous happening, so they act all anxious. Or cats do weird things in corners, and so they're trying to attack ghosts. I don't know. And so on and so forth. And we give these additional abilities to animals, and I think that's what the filmmakers are trying to do with these looks, is give them additional emotions.
I think they're really trying to give them, in some respects, humanity or something.
Yeah.
Another moment is that I thought was kind of interesting was at the end where Goliath, the chimps are loose and they're destroying the radiation chamber, and everything's in danger of blowing up.
Yeah.
And he's locked in there. And they, saves the day, basically.
Right.
That, I think, was a message as from the writers of the film too, of this sentence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or of this, he basically sacrificed himself to save the people who were harming him, right? So that's another kind of ethical thing of, that they are cooperating in this study and doing the things that are leading to them being harmed, and that's what Virgil discovered.
Yeah.
When he walked in and saw the red collar and the chimp on the table, that we are contributing to our own demise, and yet at the other one, he saved everybody and everybody cheered from him, but sacrificed himself, basically.
Yeah.
So that I think was a real message too. Yeah, and these messages maybe a little cheesy, a little corny, but again, at the time, this was the conversation, and it wasn't a given.
And I think that they are cheesy and they are corny and they are maybe a little rushed, but I think that is the intent of the filmmakers, right? Is to make them as in your face as possible. And I think we can figure that the director here, Jonathan Kaplan, was a proponent of dismantling the status quo in in animal research. This was his project to really put his mark on it. And that's what I see from this, and that's why I think some of the messages here are supposed to be in your face, kind of. And yeah, maybe they come out a little bit cheesy. Its rating is kind of in the middling. People don't like it. People are like, "Oh, this is great," and so it kind of gets in that middle. I think maybe for some of those filmmaking choices.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I want to end with a particular thing that I found interesting, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Karen, because you had put this in the notes as well, and it's something that I read even before that. I was going to put it in our shared notes doc, but I saw that you had put it in there. So one of the trivia bits for this film is that, then you can look at this trivia if you want on IMDb for Project X. It's one of the foremost bits of trivia, I guess, for this film, is that the chimps in general, and I guess maybe other non-human primates like orangutans and gorillas, etc., don't vocalize emotions the same way that humans do. This was a filmmaking choice again. So the directors said, well, that's not going to play well on camera because we need these chimps to be anthropomorphized in a way that brings them humanity, as we've discussed. So they brought in vocalizers for these chimps. They brought in humans to vocalize what sounds these chimps are making. So all of the chimp sounds that you hear in the film are overdubbed from humans making those vocalizations. And I thought that was strange. I get why, but I thought it was very strange. Karen, what do you think about this?
I did not like that at all. It just bothered me no end. All the little, and then a lot of the screams that they make. Why can't they use authentic sounds?
Yeah, I mean, we have so many, documentaries.
Yeah, so yeah, it really bothered me. Again, you can suspend disbelief for some things. That was something that just rubbed me the wrong way. It was very annoying. I guess they were trying to add to the drama and communication of the animals. I think they were also playing off of sort of the stereotype vocalizations that prior depictions had made
Okay.
of chimps going ooh, ooh ah,
yeah,
that kind of thing, and which aren't the sounds at all that I've heard. It was interesting. Some of the shots included authentic sort of nonverbal communications, like the chimps sort of rocking back and forth and getting excited and that kind of thing, going side to side, and their hair, fluffing up at piloerection kind of thing, where their hair stands up. So there were some authentic things in there, but they were almost by chance or almost, ignored. Oh, it just happened to be in the shot. They had like 5 vocalizers that they hired, and I was just really disappointed in that as well.
Yeah, and they're not even actors that tend to do voiceover work. Because I'm looking in the music department, they're just people listed under the music department as vocalizations. So they weren't even credited as cast, which is odd. But just on the face of it, like, usually give voiceover work a little bit more credit than that. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think there were some things, that the filmmakers were trying to spin or hide. So I think they were trying to downplay that. I think they gave an acknowledgement to the sanctuary primarily primates,
Mhm.
and make it sound like that's where the animals or where the apes were. But according to primarily primates, the apes were given to them after the movie was over. um, so that's another kind of layer of this ethical kind of thing. And I think we may have talked about this earlier, that in the production of the film, they were doing some things that were questionable.
Yeah,
Um,
as
so yeah,
yeah, as many animal on set things that I've heard, just not necessarily this film, but I've read additional takes and characterizations of other films that have had large animal casts on them. I don't know if film production crews are the best to take care of animals, even when animal trainers and handlers are present, because even those people may have issues.
again, this is a transitional time in our history, though. We were coming from a time where that was all perfectly fine to a time when now it's like we're like, really, you're kidding me, right? That this is how, it's awful how the animals were treated. So we have a lens now that's very different, I think, than the lens when this movie was first being implemented. But I find it highly ironic that that's the case, that they're using this large cast, and who knows how they were treating them as they were making this story with this very obvious message.
And not allowing them their own voices to be put on film.
Literally, right?
Yeah.
Not even giving them a voice. That's a great, great
showing
point.
them they're to be seen, not heard, like actual children, of course. I want to thank Dr. Karen Brakke for joining me to discuss Project X. Before we say goodbye, Karen, is there anything that you would like to plug? And, where can folks find more about your work, that either that you are doing these days or some of the work, early work that you talked about during this episode?
Well, I've got a lot of eclectic sort of academic work and interests out there. So, I guess you could just Google me if you want to for all that.
Nice.
I haven't, worked with the apes for years and years and years. But I've moved on from that.
Snapshot in time, I think.
Yeah. So, but one thing I would like to plug, one of the things I do is our department hosts the Southeastern Teaching of Psychology Conference, which you joined us last year.
Yes, because of virtualization.
That's right. And it's a fantastic conference. I think we are going virtual again in February 2022,
which means I will join.
Great. It's a great opportunity for your listeners, no matter where they are, to join us. They don't have to be in the Southeast. And we hope to have another great program this year, and hope to draw people in for future years when we can be back in person.
Awesome. Well, I really do appreciate you coming on and talking Project X with me, Karen. So it was very, very wonderful to talk to you.
You as well. Thanks so much. I had a lot of fun.
Excellent. And that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next episode, thanks for listening.